Alien blood ran cold, and skeletal limbs shook as the battle-scarred humans strode to the podium to deliver a terrifying confession that could shatter the Galactic Council. Chris Hunter, grizzled veteran of the human-Akamarian War, faced the emergency assembly of alien representatives. His cybernetic eye glowed an eerie blue as he scanned the auditorium. His face, etched with scars from a dozen worlds, was grim. Tensions crackled in the air. Rumors had swirled for days about the shocking revelation the human ambassador would unveil. The Akamarian delegate, Xanth, chittered nervously, his compound eyes fixed on Chris. Chris gripped the podium, his augmetic hand creaking. "Counselors, I'm not here to mince words. I'm a soldier. I've watched friends die in trenches on hostile planets. I've seen things that would make your heart stop. And now I must warn you of an existential threat to us all." The crowd stirred, a low susurration of clicking and hissing filling the chamber. Chris raised his voice. "The Akamarians have betrayed us. They've developed a mind control weapon capable of enslaving any sentient race, and they plan to use it to conquer the galaxy." Shouts of disbelief and outrage erupted. Xanth leapt up, mandibles snapping. "Preposterous. The humans lie. They seek to destabilize the Council for their own gain." Chris slammed his fist on the podium. The sharp crack silenced the uproar. "I have proof, leaked documents, videos, defector testimonies. The Akamarians have already turned their own people into thralls. We're next." He fixed the audience with a piercing stare. "We must act now to stop this threat, or we'll all become slaves to the Akamarian hive mind. The fate of the free galaxy is in our hands. We cannot fail." Chris's words hung in the air as the council dissolved into pandemonium. But he knew this was only the beginning. Humanity would have to fight like never before to save everyone from the Akamarians' insidious plot. The alternative was too chilling to contemplate. The Galactic Council chamber exploded into a cacophony of shouting voices as the representatives reacted to Chris's dire warning. Some pounded their fists, demanding an immediate strike against the treacherous Akamarians before their mind control weapon could be deployed. Others slammed their appendages on the consoles, insisting on reviewing the evidence in detail before taking any rash action that could plunge the galaxy into total war. A tall, willowy figure with iridescent scales flowing down its back strode through the arguing throngs toward the central podium. It was Zephyr, the Xenath ambassador. The Xenath were known for their incredibly advanced technology, which they guarded with utmost secrecy. Zephyr's large, almond-shaped eyes fixed on Chris. "Human, if what you say is true, then we are all in grave danger," Zephyr said, his voice a mellifluous hum. "The Xenath have long suspected the Akamarians of harboring dark secrets, but we lacked the evidence to act. We believe your confession, and we offer our support in this fight." Chris started to nod gratefully, but his reply was cut off as a massive explosion ripped through the chamber. A rain of twisted metal and rubble crashed down from a gaping hole that had been torn in the vaulted ceiling. Akamarian shock troops, clad in obsidian exoskeletons that shimmered with a sickly sheen, rappelled down through the breach. Plasma rifles clutched in their serrated claws, they fanned out to secure the auditorium. The Akamarian delegation rose as one, Xanth at their head. The insectoid alien's compound eyes blazed with barely contained fury as he leveled his own rifle at Chris. "You have sealed your doom, human," Xanth snarled, his mandibles clacking. Chris didn't waste time on a witty retort. He dove to the side, rolling behind a row of seats as the Akamarians opened fire. Searing plasma bolts stitched a molten line across the stage where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. All around the chamber, council members were scattering, some bolting for the exits in blind panic while others produced hidden weapons from inside their robes and began fighting back against the attackers. Through the smoke and strobing weapon flashes, Chris spotted Zephyr rallying a contingent of Xenath guards, their sinuous forms twisting through the battle as they unsheathed crackling energy blades. The Xenath ambassador locked eyes with Chris and jerked his head toward the northwest exit. Chris nodded, drawing his sidearm and popping up to snap off a few shots at the nearest Akamarians, forcing them to seek cover. He sprinted toward Zephyr, dodging and weaving as return fire sizzled past him. The Xenath guards closed ranks around the two of them, their flickering melee weapons slicing through Akamarian armor and limbs with shocking ease. Step by step, they hacked a path through the enemy soldiers, making an inexorable advance on the exit. As they burst out into the corridor beyond, Chris turned to his unlikely new ally. "We need to warn Earth and the other free worlds. The Akamarians will stop at nothing to silence us." Zephyr nodded grimly, his scales rippling. "Agreed, but we must also find a way to counter their mind control technology, or all will be lost." Alarms began to wail as they pelted down the passageway, heading for the nearest hangar bay. They piled into the first shuttle they found, not caring about the manufacturer or owner. Chris jabbed the ignition, and the small craft lurched into the air, blasting out of the station into the starry void. Almost immediately, a squadron of Akamarian fighters fell in behind them, lances of plasma hammering their shields. The shuttle jinked and juked as Chris wrenched them into a series of evasive maneuvers, but the enemy ships clung to their tail like enraged hornets. Zephyr worked frantically at the navigator's station, plotting a jump trajectory. The shuttle shuddered as more plasma blasts pounded its faltering defenses. Warning indicators flashed angry red across the control board. "Any time now would be good," Chris shouted over the cacophony of straining engines and shrieking alarms. "Coordinates locked," Zephyr reported. "Engaging hyperdrive now." Chris slapped the confirmation button, and the stars outside the view screen blurred into streaks of light. The shuttle hurtled into the swirling maelstrom of hyperspace, the Akamarian fighters receding behind them, unable to follow. But Chris knew this was only a temporary respite. The battle for the galaxy's freedom had just begun, and the odds were stacked heavily against them. The stolen shuttle shook violently as it hurtled through hyperspace, the damaged engines straining to maintain their course. In the cramped cockpit, Chris gripped the controls with white knuckles, his battered face set in a mask of concentration. Beside him, Zephyr worked furiously at the navigation console, his iridescent scales reflecting the flickering lights. "We're approaching the coordinates for Zaxis Prime," Zephyr reported, his voice tense. "Prepare to drop out of hyperspace." Chris nodded, his jaw clenched. He reached out with his augmetic hand and pulled back on the hyperdrive lever. The stars outside the view screen snapped back into focus as the shuttle decelerated, the inky void replaced by the looming shape of a rust-colored planet. As they descended through the atmosphere, the shuttle's sensors picked up a heavily shielded structure, nestled in the heart of a jagged mountain range. Zephyr leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. There, the Xenath base, transmitting landing codes now. The shuttle settled onto a hidden landing pad with a jarring thud. Chris and Zephyr disembarked, followed by the handful of survivors from the Galactic Council attack. They were met by a contingent of Xenath soldiers, their sinuous bodies encased in sleek black armor. The group was escorted into the base, passing through multiple layers of security, before emerging into a dimly lit command center. Waiting for them was a figure that made Chris's breath catch in his throat. It was an Akamarian, but unlike any he had ever seen. The alien's exoskeleton was pitted and scarred, one of his compound eyes milky with cataracts. He stood with a slight hunch, as if the weight of years pressed down upon him. "I know of you, Chris Hunter," the Akamarian rasped, his mandibles clicking. "Your name is spoken with fear and hatred among my people. But if Zephyr trusts you, then so shall I." Chris stepped forward, meeting the alien's gaze unflinchingly. "And you are?" "I am Calthor," the Akamarian replied, "leader of the rebellion against our own government's tyranny." Zephyr placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. "Calthor and his followers have been fighting the Akamarian Empire in secret for years. They may be our only hope of stopping the mind control weapon." The group gathered around a holographic display table, and Chris quickly outlined what they had learned about the Akamarians' plot. When he finished, Calthor shook his head grimly. "A bold plan, human, to strike directly at the heart of the Empire. But it will not be enough. The mind control device is not a single machine, but a network of transmitters spread throughout the galaxy. We must find and destroy each one before we can hope to defeat the Akamarians. Chris slammed his fist on the table, frustration boiling over. Then what do you suggest? We can't just sit here while they enslave the galaxy. Zephyr held up a slender hand, his eyes glittering. I believe I have a solution. The Akamarians' main research facility is located on the moon of Xandar. If we could infiltrate the base and steal the schematics for the mind control network, we would know the location of every transmitter. Calthor nodded slowly. It would be a dangerous mission. Xandar is one of the most heavily guarded installations in the Empire. Chris straightened, his cybernetic eye glowing with determination. I'll lead the strike team. We'll get those schematics no matter the cost. The plan was quickly formed. Chris and Calthor handpicked a small group of their best fighters and hackers, each one ready to lay down their lives for the cause. They would approach Xandar under cover of a meteor shower, using the chaos to slip past the Akamarian defenses. As the strike team boarded their shuttle, Zephyr pulled Chris aside. Be careful, my friend. The fate of the galaxy rests on your shoulders. Chris clasped the Xenarth's hand firmly. We won't fail, I swear it. The journey to Xandar was tense and silent, each member of the team lost in their own thoughts. As they neared the moon, the shuttle's sensors lit up with warnings. Incoming meteors, the pilot shouted, his voice tight with fear. Brace for impact. The shuttle bucked and shuddered as it plowed through the storm of rocks, its shields flaring with each collision. But the gambit worked. The Akamarian defenses were too busy tracking the meteors to notice the small craft slipping through their net. They landed in a sheltered canyon a few clicks from the research facility, the shuttle's hull pockmarked with dents and scorch marks. Chris and Calthor led the way, their weapons drawn and ready. The facility was a looming edifice of black metal and gleaming glass, bristling with gun turrets and patrolled by heavily armed guards. The strike team moved quickly and quietly, using the cover of boulders and gullies to avoid detection. At the base of the facility's walls, they split into two groups. Chris and Calthor would lead the assault on the main entrance, drawing the attention of the defenders, while the hackers slipped in through a maintenance shaft to access the central computer core. The attack began with a thunderous explosion as Chris detonated a breaching charge on the armored doors. Akamarian guards boiled out of the breach, plasma rifles spitting deadly fire. Chris and Calthor charged forward, their own weapons blazing, cutting down the defenders with ruthless efficiency. Inside the facility, it was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each one filled with deadly automated defenses and elite Akamarian soldiers. The strike team fought for every inch of ground, leaving a trail of shattered bodies and smoking wreckage in their wake. In the central computer core, the hackers worked feverishly to bypass the security systems and download the mind control schematics. But they were discovered, and soon the chamber was filled with the sound of clashing blades and sizzling energy bolts as they fought for their lives. Chris and Calthor battled their way to the core, arriving just in time to see the last of the hackers fall, a smoking hole in his chest, but clutched in his hand was a data drive. They had succeeded in their mission. The journey back to the shuttle was a running battle, the Akamarians swarming in from all sides. Chris felt the bite of plasma on his skin, smelled the acrid tang of burning flesh. His cybernetic eye flickered and died, damaged beyond repair by a lucky shot. Half of the strike team was lost in that desperate fighting retreat, cut down by the relentless Akamarian onslaught. But at last they reached the shuttle, piling in and sealing the hatches behind them. As they blasted away from Xandar, Akamarian fighters in hot pursuit, Chris clutched the precious data drive to his chest. The cost had been high, but they had struck a blow against the Akamarian Empire, and with the knowledge contained in these schematics, they could finally bring the fight to the enemy. But as he looked around the battered and bloodied survivors of the mission, Chris knew that the hardest battles were still to come. In the war-torn depths of the Xenarth base, Chris and his battered team huddled around a flickering holodisplay, their faces gaunt and exhausted. The stolen Akamarian schematics rotated slowly above the projector, a tangled web of glowing lines and pulsing nodes. Chris jabbed a finger at the largest node, his cybernetic eye whirring as it zoomed in on the image. There, the central control hub for the entire mind control network. It's on the Akamarian homeworld, protected by a planet-wide energy shield. Calthor shook his head, his scarred mandibles clicking. We'll never punch through those defenses with what we have here. We need more ships, more weapons. Chris nodded grimly, his mind racing. He turned to Zephyr, the Xenath scales glittering in the dim light. Can your people help us? Zephyr spread his hands apologetically. Our resources are stretched thin as it is. We cannot spare any more ships or soldiers for this fight. Chris slammed his fist on the console, frustration boiling over. Damn it! We can't let the Akamarians win, not when we're so close. Suddenly an idea sparked in his mind. He looked up, a fierce grin spreading across his face. I know someone who can help us, an old friend from my mercenary days, Jax Rayner. Calthor tilted his head, compound eyes narrowing. The human smuggler? I've heard of him. They say he'll take any job for the right price. Chris shrugged. Jax may be a bit rough around the edges, but he's the best damn pilot I've ever seen. And he's got connections in every shady corner of the galaxy. If anyone can get us the firepower we need, it's him. He strode over to the comm station and punched in a sequence of codes. The screen flickered to life, resolving into the roguishly handsome face of Jax Rayner. The mercenary grinned, his teeth flashing white against his dark stubble. Well, well, if it isn't Chris Hunter. What's the matter, old friend? Galaxy in peril again? Chris chuckled, shaking his head. You could say that, Jax. I need your help. We're going up against the Akamarians, and we need all the guns we can get. Jax whistled, leaning back in his chair. The Bug Boys, huh? You always did have a knack for picking fights with the nastiest bastards in the universe. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his eyes glinting with a mix of greed and excitement. All right, I'm in, but I'm not coming alone. I've got a crew of the meanest, toughest sons of bitches this side of the galactic core. We'll get you your firepower, don't worry. The screen winked out, and Chris turned back to the others, a fierce determination burning in his gaze. All right, people, let's get to work. We've got a war to win. Hours later, the roar of engines filled the hangar bay as Jax's ship touched down, the battered hull scarred with the marks of 1,000 firefights. The mercenary strode down the ramp, a cocky grin on his face as he clasped Chris's hand. Good to see you again, you crazy bastard. I hope you're ready for some action. Behind him, a motley crew of aliens and humans emerged from the ship, bristling with weapons and attitude. Among them, a lithe figure caught Chris's eye, a human woman with raven-black hair and piercing green eyes. She moved with the deadly grace of a predator, a sleek pistol holstered at her hip. Jax followed Chris's gaze and smirked. I see you've noticed Aria Blackwood. Best damn hacker in the business, but she's got a temper hotter than a supernova. Watch yourself around her. As the two groups mingled, the air crackled with tension. Old rivalries and grudges simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Chris found himself playing peacemaker, breaking up arguments and soothing bruised egos. But even as he struggled to hold the fragile alliance together, doubts gnawed at his mind. Could they really pull this off? The odds were stacked against them, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. He shook off the dark thoughts squaring his shoulders. They had to succeed, there was no other choice. As the final preparations were made, and the strike teams assembled in the hangar bay, the wail of alarms suddenly split the air. Red lights flashed and klaxons blared as the base's sensors registered incoming ships. Zephyr sprinted to the command center, his eyes widening in horror as he scanned the displays. Akamarian warships, a whole fleet of them. They've found us. Chris cursed under his breath. Xanth, he must have tracked the stolen schematics. The base shuddered as the first salvo of plasma missiles slammed into the shields, alarms shrieking with each impact. Smoke began to fill the corridors as fires broke out across the facility. We have to evacuate, Calthor shouted over the chaos. The shields won't hold for long. Chris nodded grimly, his mind racing. They couldn't abandon the mission, not when they were so close, but they couldn't let Xanth wipe them out either. He turned to Jax, a desperate plan forming in his mind. Jax, I need you and your crew to lead a diversionary attack on the Akamarian fleet. Draw their fire, buy us some time to slip away. The mercenary grinned fiercely, a feral light in his eyes. You got it, boss. We'll give those bug-faced bastards a fight they won't soon forget. Chris clasped his friend's arm, emotion welling up in his throat. Thank you, Jax, for everything. He turned to Zephyr and Calthor, his voice grim. We'll take a stealth ship, try to sneak past the blockade and make for the Akamarian homeworld. It's our only chance to end this, once and for all. As the base crumbled around them, the two groups raced for their ships, dodging falling debris and energy blasts. Chris, Zephyr, and Calthor sprinted up the ramp of the sleek black stealth vessel, the hatch sealing shut behind them with a hiss. Through the viewports, Chris watched as Jax's ship roared out of the hangar, weapons blazing as it charged headlong into the teeth of the Akamarian fleet. Plasma beams and missiles crisscrossed the void, the mercenary vessel weaving and dodging through the maelstrom with impossible grace. The stealth ship slipped away in the confusion, its cloaking field shimmering as it vanished into the darkness of space. But even as they raced towards the Akamarian homeworld and the final confrontation, Chris's heart was heavy with fear for his friends. Suddenly the comms crackled to life, Jax's voice barely audible through the static. Chris, we've taken heavy damage, shields are down, they're boarding us. Laser fire and screams echoed in the background, the sounds of desperate battle. Chris's hand clenched on the armrest, his knuckles white. Jax, hold on, we're coming back for you. But the mercenary's voice was fading, the transmission breaking up. No, stick to the plan, you have to stop them, Chris. You have to... The link went dead, leaving only silence. Chris closed his eyes, agony etched on his face. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to save his friends. But he knew he couldn't. The fate of the galaxy was at stake. With a heavy heart, he opened his eyes and stared out at the looming shape of the Akamarian homeworld, a shadow of dread and despair rising up to swallow them whole. The final battle awaited, and the price of victory would be higher than any of them had ever imagined. The stolen stealth ship sliced through the void, a black dagger aimed at the heart of the Akamarian homeworld. Chris gripped the controls, his face set in grim lines. Beside him, Zephyr and Calthor checked their weapons, the anticipation thick in the air. The planet loomed before them, a seething mass of dark metal and noxious smog. They punched through the atmosphere, alarms wailing as the ship bucked in the turbulence. Anti-air batteries opened up, filling the sky with deadly fire. Chris jinked and juked, relying on the ship's cloaking field to keep them hidden. They sat down in the outskirts of the capital, a sprawling necropolis of towering spires and squalid warrens. The air was thick with the stench of rot and despair. Zephyr wrinkled his nose in disgust. The sooner we end this, the better. They moved out, darting through the twisting alleys and crumbling ruins. Calthor took point, his knowledge of the city guiding them through the labyrinth. They encountered patrols of Akamarian soldiers, hulking brutes in chitinous armor. The team struck from the shadows, leaving a trail of twitching corpses in their wake. As they neared the central control hub, the resistance intensified. Swarms of drones buzzed overhead, raking the streets with searing beams of energy. Elite guards, their exoskeletons gleaming with deadly enhancements, barred their path. Chris and his team fought like demons, their weapons spitting fire and death. Zephyr danced through the enemy ranks, his energy blades flashing as he cut down foes left and right. Calthor was a one-man army, his heavy plasma cannon roaring as he mowed down wave after wave of attackers. Chris moved like a ghost, his cybernetic eye picking out targets with cold precision, his augmetic hand crushing throats and snapping spines. But even their formidable skills were not enough. The Akamarians kept coming, an endless tide of flesh and steel. Zephyr cried out as a plasma bolt seared through his shoulder, dropping him to one knee. Calthor stood over him, his cannon hammering until it ran dry, then switched to a wicked-looking battle-axe, hacking and slashing at the press of bodies. Chris fought his way to their side, desperation lending him strength. "Go," Calthor roared, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "I'll hold them off." Chris nodded grimly, hauling Zephyr to his feet. They staggered towards the entrance of the control hub, leaving Calthor to his fate. The doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of carnage. The chamber was vast, a cavernous space filled with pulsing machinery and flickering holoscreens. And there, in the center of it all, stood Xanth. The Akamarian leader was flanked by a dozen of his most elite warriors, their weapons trained on the intruders. "Welcome, Chris Hunter," Xanth hissed, his mandibles clacking with cruel amusement. "I must admit I'm impressed. You've caused quite a bit of trouble for me." Chris raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It ends here, Xanth. Surrender, and I might let you live." The Akamarian threw back his head and laughed, a rasping, chittering sound that set Chris's teeth on edge. "You think you've won? You know nothing, human." He gestured to the machinery around them, his compound eyes glittering. "This is more than just a weapon. It's our salvation. Without the mind control device, the Akamarian species will perish. We are dying, our genetic structure unraveling after centuries of war and radiation. This technology is the only thing keeping us alive." Chris hesitated, his aim wavering. Xanth pressed his advantage, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "You have a choice, Chris Hunter. Destroy the device and condemn an entire race to extinction, or let it continue and save us from oblivion." Chris's mind raced, the weight of the decision crushing him. He thought of all the lives lost, all the worlds enslaved by the Akamarians' insidious plot. But he also thought of an entire species, desperate and dying, clinging to any hope of survival. In the end, there was only one choice he could make. With a heavy heart, he lowered his rifle and stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Xanth chittered in surprise, then reached out to take it. But at the last moment, Chris lunged, his augmetic hand closing around Xanth's throat. The Akamarian leader thrashed and gurgled, his guards surging forward, but Zephyr leapt into their midst, his energy blades singing. Chris slammed Xanth against the control console, his face inches from the aliens. "You should have surrendered," he growled. Then he activated the self-destruct sequence, the countdown beginning with a blaring alarm. He released Xanth's lifeless body and turned to Zephyr. "Time to go." They ran, fighting their way back through the collapsing city as the device began to overload. Buildings crumbled and explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet. They barely made it back to their ship, leaping aboard just as a massive shockwave obliterated the capital behind them. As they blasted away from the planet, Chris slumped in his seat, exhaustion and grief overwhelming him. The Akamarian Empire was no more, but the cost had been staggering. Billions dead, countless worlds left in ruins, and the knowledge that he had been the one to pull the trigger, to doom an entire species to extinction. In the aftermath, the galaxy was in chaos. The power vacuum left by the Akamarians' fall led to new conflicts, new horrors. Some called Chris and his team heroes, saviors of the free worlds. Others cursed their names, reviling them as monsters and mass murderers. They went their separate ways, each haunted by the choices they had made and the lives they had taken. Chris returned to Earth, but found that the world he had fought for was no longer his home. The things he had seen, the deeds he had done, had changed him irrevocably. He wandered the stars, a solitary figure adrift in an uncaring universe. His path took him to distant worlds and uncharted reaches, always seeking some new cause to champion, some new wrong to right. But the ghosts of his past followed him wherever he went, the faces of the dead forever etched into his memory. Years passed, decades blurring together in an endless march of time, and still Chris Hunter endured, a relic of a bygone age, a hero in a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of the word. On a nameless world, far from the beaten paths of civilization, He stood atop a windswept cliff, his gaze turned towards the stars. He was older now, his face lined with the passage of years and the weight of his sins. But in his eyes, a faint spark still glimmered, a sense of purpose, of destiny unfulfilled. For he knew that his journey was not yet over, that somewhere out there a new threat lurked, a new battle awaited, and he would be ready to meet it, to fight and bleed and sacrifice as he always had. For that was the burden of the hero, the price of being human. To stare into the darkness and not flinch away, to stand against the tide and say, no more. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.